An old man with a battered Garand
Who is
walks
that
onto
guy?
Camp Pendleton's range,
That's Edward
drawing
Marshall.
laughs from young Marines. The firing
That
line
old man
erupts,
just...
M4 carbines blazing, yet
He
Edward
nailed it.
Marshall lies calm, steady, and ready with his vintage Garand.
He
Targets
thinks he's still
return
in the
full
war.
of perfect center hits. Marines stare in disbelief as the old veteran outshoots
Look at that
them
old
all.
guy.
The once mocked
You
veteran
want a
kneels
natural point of
patiently,
aim?
teaching young Marines the
Relax
discipline and
into it
respect
and
behind
focus on your
every
breath.
trigger pull. At sunset, Edward Marshall stands by a plaque.
Who is
The
that
warrior
guy?
makes the weapon.
An old
His
timer, I
quiet
guess.
legacy lives on. Follow us for more moving stories of sacrifice and remembrance. The California sun hung low over Camp Pendleton, stretching long shadows across the wide outdoor shooting range. It was qualification day for Alpha Company, a group of fresh-faced Marines barely out of boot camp. Their voices carried across the crisp morning air, boasting, laughing, talking about scores they were sure they'd earn. With brand-new M4 carbines slung across their shoulders, they carried the confidence of youth, the belief that modern technology and a few months of training could make them unstoppable. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen paced the firing line, sharp eyes scanning for flaws in posture, weapon safety, or misplaced arrogance. At 35, Chen had seen this scene countless times. Every cycle, recruits arrived thinking they were experts after basic training, and every cycle, the targets humbled them. He let them brag, knowing that the steel downrange would be the true judge. But today's routine was broken by an unexpected figure. Moving steadily, though with the weight of age on his steps, came a man who seemed entirely out of place. His clothes were simple faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a sun-bleached baseball cap without insignia. What turned heads, however, wasn't his appearance. It was the rifle in his weathered hands. It looked like something from a museum, a weapon that belonged behind glass rather than on a live firing range. A few young Marines burst out laughing. "Check out Grandpa over there," whispered Private Kyle Donovan, a cocky 19-year-old from Texas. "That thing even legal? Looks like it survived World War II. The others chuckled, nudging each other, but the old man paid no attention. He walked with calm certainty, laying his rifle down at an empty firing position. From a worn leather pouch, he drew ammunition that gleamed with age, brass casings dulled, rounds clearly hand-loaded with care. Staff Sergeant Chen stepped forward, professional courtesy masking his curiosity. "Sir, I'll need to see your range card and some identification. Also, what kind of rifle is that?" The man looked up with steady blue eyes, his voice even. "M1 Garand, 30-06 Springfield." He passed over an ID card, its plastic edges worn smooth. Chen's brow rose as he read, "Retired Master Sergeant Edward Marshall. Service, 1964, 1994. The laughter began to fade. Donovan muttered again, but softer this time, "No way that thing still works." Marshall simply smiled as he thumbed cartridges into the Garand's clip. The metallic ping of the mechanism rang across the range, a sound unfamiliar to the younger generation, yet heavy with history. For the first time that morning, silence touched the firing line. No one could explain it, but something about the old man's presence about that rifle made the Marines uneasy. They didn't know it yet, but before the day was over, their idea of what it meant to be a marksman would change forever. The crackle of anticipation built as Staff Sergeant Chen gave the range commands. "Alpha Company, on the line, weapons ready." 20 recruits dropped into position, their carbines bristling with scopes, attachments, and every modern advantage. They were nervous but eager. Ed Marshall lay down among them, his antique Garand resting naturally in his hands. While the young Marines adjusted optics and fiddled with bipods, Ed moved with the kind of confidence that comes from repetition carved into bone. He slid smoothly into a textbook-prone stance, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, his cheek resting against the stock as though he had never left a battlefield. Private Donovan couldn't resist one last jab. Hope the recoil doesn't knock you flat, old man. A ripple of laughter spread down the line. Ed didn't answer. He just exhaled slowly and loaded his clip. The distinctive metallic ping echoed again, cutting through the chatter. Chen's sharp glance silenced the recruits, though a smirk lingered on Donovan's face. Range is hot, the command rang out. With a sudden rise, the targets snapped up silhouettes at 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500 yards. The line erupted in gunfire. The air filled with the mechanical rhythm of semi-automatic fire, brass casings bouncing off concrete, the sharp pop-pop-pop of modern M4 seconds blending into one frantic chorus. Then, like a drumbeat against the noise, came another sound. Boom! The Garand's shot rolled across the range, deeper, heavier, unmistakable. Then silence. A breath. Boom. At first, no one noticed. They were too focused on firing fast, trying to prove themselves. But as seconds stretched on, a strange realization spread. While their own bullets peppered the targets erratically, every thunderous report of Ed's rifle was followed by a distinct metallic clang from downrange. Private Donovan risked a glance sideways. His smirk vanished. Ed wasn't just firing, he was surgical. Every time the rifle barked, another center mass hit appeared hundreds of yards away. The man's breathing was steady, his trigger squeeze unhurried, his eyes unflinching. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Chen's voice boomed when time was up. The Marines eased their rifles down, some exchanging confident nods, others wiping sweat. Donovan spun his safety on with bravado, pretending not to notice Ed still calmly lowering his Garand. But Chen's binoculars told a different story. He scanned one lane, then another, and stopped cold at Ed's targets. His mouth went dry. Range safety, get those pulled. Now. The gunnery sergeant moved quickly, high-powered optics confirming what Chen had seen. His voice, normally gravel-hard, cracked into disbelief. Holy hell! The targets came back, paper edges fluttering in the breeze. The recruits crowded around, their earlier laughter gone. At 100 yards, perfect center. At 200, another tight cluster. At 300 and 400, groups so precise they overlapped. At 500 yards, where most of the new Marines had barely scratched the silhouette, Ed's grouping could be covered with a silver dollar. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Donovan swallowed hard, eyes wide. That's not possible. The gunnery sergeant shook his head. Son, I've seen Marine snipers who couldn't do this with glass scopes and match-grade ammo. Ed just wiped down the Garand with a rag, calm as ever. Practice, he said quietly. Lots of practice. But Donovan wasn't satisfied. His voice was edged with desperation now. Come on, there's no way it's just practice. What's your secret? Ed looked up, and for the first time really studied their young faces. They weren't mocking now. They were searching, hungry for an explanation. You were all shooting to hit targets, Ed said evenly. I was shooting to stop threats. The words landed heavier than the rifle's recoil. The range went quiet again, not from command, but from the sudden weight of his truth. The recruits realized, almost at once, that this wasn't just an old man with a museum piece. This was a warrior, forged in a place where every bullet had decided whether a brother lived or died. And for the first time that day, Private Donovan had nothing left to say. The silence at the range hung heavy, thicker than gunpowder smoke. Every Marine, from the cocky privates to the hardened sergeants, had their eyes fixed on Edward Marshall. A few minutes earlier, they had mocked him. Now, they stood in reverent disbelief, surrounded by paper targets that told a story louder than any boast. Staff Sergeant Chen broke the hush first. Master Sergeant Marshall, he said carefully, using the retired rank printed on the ID. With respect, how did you just outshoot 20 Marines with a 70-year-old rifle? Ed continued wiping down the Garand, movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. He didn't look up. Practice, he said simply, repeating the same word. But this time, there was something deeper in his tone, something that made even the youngest Marines lean in. Private Donovan, his earlier bravado shattered, couldn't stop himself. Practice? No, sir. That's not it. You shoot like a machine. What's the secret? His voice cracked, with equal parts frustration and awe. Finally, Ed set the rifle down. His hands, though lined with age, were steady as stone. He looked at the faces gathered around him, young men full of fire, cockiness, and fear they didn't yet know how to name. He recognized those faces. He had seen them decades ago, in the jungles of a faraway land. You want to know the difference? He asked. His voice was quiet, but cut through the breeze like a blade. The Marines nodded, forming a circle around him. You were all trying to hit targets. I was trying to stop threats. Confused frowns spread. The distinction sounded subtle, almost meaningless. But Ed continued. Every time you pulled your triggers today, you thought about scores, about passing qualifications, about showing off to your buddies. Every time I pulled mine, I was remembering faces. The recruits shifted uneasily. Faces? Staff Sergeant Chen echoed, his brow furrowed. Ed nodded slowly. His eyes, once steady and clinical, softened with something else, memory and pain. In 1968, outside Da Nang, my squad was pinned down by a sniper. We couldn't see him, couldn't find his position, but every few minutes, one of my boys would try to move, and every few minutes, another boy wouldn't move again. The air grew colder. Even the wind seemed to hush. Ed took a long breath before continuing. I finally caught a muzzle flash. 400 yards, maybe more. Iron sights. I had one chance before he relocated. If I missed, more of my brothers would die. His jaw tightened. I didn't miss. The young Marines hung on every word. Donovan, who only hours ago had laughed at the man, now stared as if watching a legend step down from the pages of history. That was one shot, Ed said. But it wasn't the last. Over 13 months, I took 47 lives. Every single one was to save American lives. Every single pull of the trigger meant someone came home alive. That's the difference. When I learned to shoot, missing wasn't about failing a test. Missing meant my brothers died. A heavy silence fell. For many of the recruits, it was the first time they truly understood what their rifles represented. They weren't toys. They weren't tools for bragging rights. They were lifelines. Private Donovan swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. So, it's not about the weapon? Ed's eyes flicked to his Garand, resting quietly in its case. He shook his head. The weapon doesn't make the warrior. The warrior makes the weapon. The words landed like scripture. They carried weight, history, blood. And in that moment, the recruits understood why their technology and optics hadn't mattered. They were still thinking like competitors. Ed thought like a survivor. Staff Sergeant Chen, his arms crossed, finally spoke again. Master Sergeant Marshall, why didn't you say who you were from the start? Why come in here like just another shooter? Ed rose to his feet, slinging the Garand case over his shoulder. His back was straight, his movements calm. Because it doesn't matter who I was, he said. What matters is what you can learn. And today, if you were paying attention, you learned that fancy gear doesn't replace fundamentals, patience, and respect for your weapon. He started toward the parking lot. For a moment, it seemed the lesson was over. But then a voice called out, breaking the trance. Master Sergeant Marshall. It was Donovan again, but his tone was different now, earnest, desperate. Sir, would you teach us, show us how to shoot like that? Ed stopped. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the young faces that had gone from mocking to humbled. For the first time that day, a wide smile spread across his weathered face. Son, he said, his voice tinged with warmth. I've been waiting 60 years for someone to ask me that question. In that instant, the day ceased being just another qualification. It became the beginning of something far more powerful, the passing of wisdom from one generation of warriors to the next. The Marines didn't realize it yet, but their lives and their approach to their rifles had just changed forever. The following Saturday, the familiar rattle of M4 carbines echoed across Camp Pendleton's range, but mixed among the noise was the deep, authoritative boom of a Garand. Edward Marshall was back. At first, only a handful of Marines had shown up, drawn by curiosity more than conviction. Private Donovan was there, of course, determined to prove he could learn from the man who had shattered his pride. A few others lingered in the background, pretending they were just watching. But soon, word spread. By the second week, a dozen Marines waited for him. By the third, nearly the entire platoon had gathered. Marshall never carried himself like a celebrity, never asked for attention. He simply unpacked his rifle, laid out his ammunition, and began. When the Marines approached, he welcomed them with a nod. "First thing," he said, his voice steady, "you need to slow down. The trigger isn't a button to be pressed, it's a decision. Every pull has weight." The young Marines listened more intently than they had in weeks of formal instruction. Marshall didn't talk about scores or qualifying. He talked about survival, about keeping calm when adrenaline begged you to rush, about breathing in sync with your heartbeat, about squeezing instead of jerking. His words carried the authority of someone who had lived the consequences of getting it wrong. Donovan, once the loudest skeptic, became the most dedicated student. He repeated Marshall's drills long after others packed up, measuring every breath, every trigger pull. "Again," Marshall would say, correcting his stance, adjusting the set of his shoulders, "until it feels natural, until it's part of you." It wasn't just marksmanship that Marshall taught. He instilled a respect for the weapon itself. "This rifle," he said one morning, holding up the Garand, "saved my life and the lives of my brothers. Your rifle will do the same for you if you treat it as more than a piece of metal, if you respect it." That struck a chord. Slowly, the recruits began to change. The range was no longer filled with nervous chatter or jokes about scores. Instead, there was focus and almost reverent silence as Marines worked through Marshall's methods. Weeks turned into months. Alpha Company's shooting habits transformed. Their groupings tightened. Their confidence grew. But this time, it was quiet confidence, rooted in discipline rather than bravado. When qualification came around again, the results spoke louder than any speech. Alpha Company posted the highest scores in the battalion's history. Staff Sergeant Chen, who had quietly observed every Saturday, finally approached Marshall. "You've done more in a few weeks than I could in months. You didn't just improve their shooting, you changed the way they think." Marshall shrugged, almost embarrassed by the praise. "All I did was remind them that this," he tapped his rifle, "isn't about competition. It's about coming home alive." Donovan earned his expert marksman badge that cycle, his transformation undeniable. The once cocky recruit had grown into a quiet, focused Marine. His accuracy caught the attention of higher command, and soon he was recommended for sniper training. He never forgot to credit Marshall. But perhaps the greatest change wasn't visible on paper. It was in the way Alpha Company carried themselves. They spoke with more respect for each other, for their weapons, for the job they were preparing to do. They had learned that technology and attachments could never replace fundamentals, patience, and the mindset of a warrior. Marshall never asked for recognition. He still arrived each Saturday morning, carrying the same old Garand and that same worn leather pouch of hand-loaded ammunition. He still outshot Marines half a century younger, but now, instead of smirks or mockery, he was greeted with nods of respect. The transformation was complete, from skeptic to student, from laughter to reverence. Alpha Company had found not just a mentor, but a living reminder of what it truly meant to bear arms. And for Edward Marshall, the role suited him. He hadn't come seeking attention, he had come seeking purpose. And in these young Marines, 'he' had found it again. 6 months after that first unforgettable day on the range, Camp Pendleton felt different. The young Marines of Alpha Company carried themselves with a sharper discipline, their movements deliberate, their weapons handled with a respect that hadn't been there before. They still joked, still laughed, like men their age should, but when it came to marksmanship, there was no more arrogance. There was focus. Edward Marshall remained at the center of that change. Every Saturday, he still arrived in faded jeans and a sun-bleached cap, carrying the same battered Garand. He never missed a week, and the Marines never stopped coming. What began with a handful of curious recruits had grown into a standing room-only crowd of eager learners. Even officers now stopped by, quietly watching the old man who could outshoot their best with iron sights and steady hands. Marshall's teachings went far beyond technique. Yes, their groupings improved, and yes, their qualification scores soared. But what mattered most was the mindset he left them with, that every shot carried weight, that weapons were not for pride but for protection, and that skill was meaningless without patience and respect. Private Donovan embodied this transformation. Once the loudest skeptic, he had become Marshall's shadow. His focus earned him an expert marksman badge, then a slot in sniper training. But more than accolades, he carried Marshall's philosophy. You're not shooting to hit a target. You're shooting to save lives. One crisp autumn morning, Alpha Company gathered before training to find a new plaque mounted near the range. It wasn't flashy, just a polished bronze plate on a wooden post. The words etched into it stopped them all in their tracks. Dedicated to Master Sergeant Edward Marshall, who taught us that the weapon doesn't make the warrior makes the weapon. Marshall never asked for it, never even mentioned it when he walked past. He only smiled faintly, set up his rifle, and went about teaching as always. Because to him, legacy wasn't about plaques or titles. Legacy was in the steady hands of the Marines who now carried his lessons forward. The young men who once mocked him had become his students, and through them, his knowledge would live on. They would pass it to others, in training, in combat, in quiet moments when steady aim meant survival. Edward Marshall didn't seek recognition. He didn't need it. He had already earned it decades ago in the jungles of Vietnam. What mattered to him now was giving back, ensuring the next generation understood that skill came not from technology, but from patience, respect, and the will to protect. And so, each Saturday, the range filled with the sharp chatter of modern carbines and the deep, timeless boom of a Garand, a sound that reminded everyone within earshot that true mastery never grows old, and that sometimes the most unassuming teacher can change an entire generation.